Historical and Moral Essays of Lord Acton, a fascinating collection of articles written by a very erudite man. So, Lord Acton, if you don't know, was a British historian and politician who served, I think, briefly as a Liberal MP under Gladstone, and who is perhaps best remembered today for being the originator of the phrase, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Lord Acton was, by and large, a skeptic when it came to power and a champion of liberty. And this book is essentially just a collection of, I suppose, some of his more prominent essays. And the book is comprised of the essays The History of Freedom in Antiquity, which is about, as its title might indicate, the history of freedom in the pre Christian world, Athens, Greece, and Rome, that kind of thing. And then The History of Freedom in Christianity, which is about the history of freedom in the Christian era and the effect that Christianity has had upon governments the world over and such like that. And Sir Erskine May's Democracy in Europe, which is actually a book review of a book entitled Democracy in Europe by someone named Sir Erskine May. I don't know who that is. And then the essay Nationality, which is kind of about nationality, national identity, and ethnicity, and the relationship between those things. And then the essay Inaugural Lecture on the Study of History, and that is a lecture which he gave pertaining to history as a discipline, because Lord Acton was himself a historian and a very passionate one at that. You can really feel the passion behind that essay. And then we have Beginning of the Modern State, which is about, as its title might indicate, the beginning of the state in the modern sense as we conceive of it, and the kind of duplicitous effects that the philosophy of, say, like Machiavelli has had upon modern governance, and kind of setting back our conception of what a government is allowed to do and not allowed to do. And it's kind of a theme throughout this book that you can pick up on, of how liberty has been kind of wrested from the hands of power and tyranny throughout history, and how it's only comparatively recently and kind of after the advent of Christianity that we come to conceive of like a higher law than just state fiat, right? There is some kind of higher ethical standard than just whatever the ruler says, and how Machiavelli essentially kind of set us back in that regard by divorcing politics from morality. And then we have the essay The New World, which is about the discovery of the Americas and the effect that that has had upon world history. And then we have the essay The Rise of the Whigs, which is about the rise of the Whig Party and their impact on the history of English politics. Then we have The Life and Times of Edmund Burke, which is another book review, this time of a biography of Edmund Burke. And then finally, we have the essay The American Revolution, which is, as its title probably gives away, Lord Acton's reflections upon the American Revolution and what it signified and the effect it has had upon the world. So that is what the book contains. And I have to say, it is a pretty fascinating work. You can really feel not only the passion for history behind this, but the passion for freedom, you might say, because a lot of these essays, especially the ones concerning freedom in antiquity and freedom in Christianity, are concerned about how, again, freedom is a hard-won thing that has had to be fought for throughout the ages and has had various setbacks along the way. Very interesting stuff. Again, but I have to say I'm not totally in agreement with Lord Acton on everything, perhaps, because in one of these essays, and I can't remember, I think it's the essay on the beginning of the modern state. I think it's in that essay in which he talks about the advent of like social insurance policies and like public relief and stuff like that. And while those things definitely have noble sentiments behind them, and I don't really aim to impugn those sentiments in and of themselves, but those things are the things that eventually, given long enough, become quite hostile to the concept of liberty. And there is a reason why the Liberal Party in England eventually gave way to the Labour Party, and there's a reason why the Labour Party that is currently in power in England at the moment is one of the most despotic and despicable governments of the modern Occident. And that is because charity and compassion are such noble things, certainly. But those things, when coupled with political fiat, lose some of their luster, and as I said, over time, eventually become quite hostile to the concept of liberty. And so I did find that a little odd that Lord Acton, who otherwise seemed to be such a real champion and defender of freedom, was somewhat prone to praise those things and adulate those things, even though eventually that kind of thinking was what eventually turned the Liberal Party, of which Lord Acton was a member, into basically the opposite of what it stood for at that time. I'm talking, of course, about how the concept of liberalism eventually transformed from its classical to its modern variety, which are basically totally opposed to each other, honestly. So I would have to disagree with him somewhat upon that point. But that's just an aside, I suppose. Overall, this book was very fascinating, and it offers a window into a very learned mind, because Lord Acton was a very learned man, especially when it came to history, and he was very passionate about it. And these essays can be quite insightful, really. And so I suppose to wrap up, I would like to read a few excerpts from the book, which I found of interest. Starting out, I would actually like to read from the final essay, which is on the American Revolution. And I would like to read this passage here, where Lord Acton writes, "That was the mild beginning of the greatest revolution that had ever broken out among civilized men. The dispute had been reduced to its simplest expression and had become a mere question of principle. The argument from the charters, the argument from the Constitution, was discarded. The case was fought out on the ground of the law of nature, more properly speaking, of divine right. On that evening of December 16th, 1773, it became, for the first time, the reigning force in history. By the rules of right, which had been obeyed till then, England had the better cause. By the principle which was then inaugurated, England was in the wrong, and the future belonged to the colonies." As I said, one of the main themes of this book is kind of how modern governance has developed, and how eventually the conception of a higher law than mortal politicians was reached. And I think that passage really sums that up quite nicely, because the American Revolution was a philosophical revolution in a way, as it was not just about petty grievances between colonies and the colonizer, but it was about something deeper than that. It was about, as Lord Acton said, the law of nature or divine right, whether there is a principle that was violated by England and which demanded redress and severance, And I think that passage really kind of encapsulates that quite well. But then over here we have in the essay Sir Erskine May's Democracy in Europe. Again, this is a book review, a kind of rambling book review of this book. But Lord Acton here writes about the dangers inherent in democracy, even though the democracy is popularly conceived, and perhaps not unjustly so, as being a more liberal and more free form of governance than monarchy or like an aristocracy or what have you. But democracy is not without its pitfalls, and Lord Acton writes here, the manifest, the avowed difficulty is that democracy, no less than monarchy or aristocracy, sacrifices everything to maintain itself and strives with an energy and a plausibility that kings and nobles cannot attain to override representation, to annul all the forces of resistance and deviation, and to secure by plebiscite, referendum, or caucus free play for the will of the majority. The true democratic principle that none shall have power over the people is taken to mean that none shall be able to restrain or to elude its power. The true democratic principle that the people shall not be made to do what it does not like is taken to mean that it shall never be required to tolerate what it does not like. The true democratic principle that every man's free will shall be as unfettered as possible is taken to mean that the free will of the collective people shall be fettered in nothing. Religious toleration, judicial independence, dread of centralization, jealousy of state interference become obstacles to freedom instead of safeguards when the centralized force of the state is wielded by the hands of the people. Democracy claims to be not only supreme without authority above, but absolute without independence below, to be its own master, not a trustee. The old sovereigns of the world are exchanged for a new one, who may be flattered and deceived, but whom it is impossible to corrupt or to resist, and to whom must be rendered the things that are Caesar's and also the things that are God's. The enemy to be overcome is no longer the absolutism of the state, but the liberty of the subject. And I think that's a very insightful and valuable passage that really does lay bare kind of the inherent danger of unchecked democracy, and that's why constitutional restraints and limitations are so vital when it comes to democratic societies, because the will of the people can commit atrocities just as heinous as the will of an autocrat or tyrant. And I think that Lord Acton is very keen to see the danger that lurks at the heart of democracy when it is left unchecked by any kind of limitation or restraint. So that was a great passage. And then finally, in the essay, The History of Freedom in Christianity, I would like to read this kind of extended passage because I think it is very, very insightful. But I have reached the end of my time and have hardly come to the beginning of my task. In the ages of which I have spoken, the history of freedom was the history of the thing that was not. But since the Declaration of Independence, or to speak more justly, since the Spaniards, deprived of their king, made a new government for themselves, the only known forms of liberty, republics, and constitutional monarchy have made their way over the world. It would have been interesting to trace the reaction of America on the monarchies that achieved its independence, to see how the sudden rise of political economy suggested the idea of applying the methods of science to the art of government, how Louis XVI, after confessing that despotism was useless even to make men happy by compulsion, appealed to the nation to do what was beyond his skill, and thereby resigned his scepter to the middle class and the intelligent men of France, shuddering at the awful recollections of their own experience, struggled to shut out the past that they might deliver their children from the prince of the world and rescue the living from the clutch of the dead, until the finest opportunity ever given to the world was thrown away, because the passion for equality made vain the hope of freedom. And I should have wished to show you that the same deliberate rejection of the moral code which smoothed the paths of absolute monarchy and of oligarchy signalized the advent of the democratic claim to unlimited power, that one of its leading champions avowed the design of corrupting the moral sense of men in order to destroy the influence of religion, and a famous apostle of enlightenment and toleration wished that the last king might be strangled with the entrails of the last priest. I would have tried to explain the connection between the doctrine of Adam Smith, that labor is the original source of all wealth, and the conclusion that the producers of wealth virtually compose the nation, by which CA subverted historic France, and to show that Rousseau's definition of the social compact as a voluntary association of equal partners conducted Marat by short and unavoidable stages to declare that the poorer classes were absolved by the law of self-preservation from the conditions of a contract which awarded to them misery and death, that they were at war with society and had a right to all they could get by exterminating the rich, and that their inflexible theory of equality, the chief legacy of the revolution, together with the avowed inadequacy of economic science to grapple with the problems of the poor, revived the idea of renovating society on the principle of self-sacrifice, which had been the generous aspiration of the Essenes and the early Christians, of fathers and canonists and friars, of Erasmus, the most celebrated precursor of the Reformation, of Sir Thomas More, its most illustrious victim, and of Fenelon, the most popular of bishops, but which, during the 40 years of its revival, has been associated with envy and hatred and bloodshed, and is now the most dangerous enemy lurking in our path. That extended passage there, I think, is of vital importance. And it was also very forward thinking, by the way, as he saw the fact that the mistaken belief that labor is the source of all wealth, that is the labor theory of value, would lead and had already in many ways led to calamitous results for society. He kind of prefigures the advent of communism in that passage. But again, he also is kind of touching on the fact that things which are noble when voluntary and uncompelled, such as charity and selflessness, lose, as I said, some of their luster and become very dangerous, or can become very dangerous at the very least, when modified to fit with political power. And so I think that section right there is perhaps, I might say, the most valuable in the whole book, or at least to me anyway, because again, it offers some very, very valuable insights, and it was quite forward thinking once again. So yes, the historical and moral essays of Lord Acton. I'm not going to rate this book because, again, it's just a collection of essays, and you know I normally don't rate non-fictional works of this sort, but I will say it was a fascinating read, and it was an interesting glimpse into the mind of a very erudite and very passionate man who was very, again, passionate about the field of history. And yeah, I enjoyed reading it. I really did. I think that this book was a pretty good read for me, so I won't rate it. But yeah, historical and moral essays of Lord Acton. Have you read any or all of these essays or anything by Lord Acton? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought. And if you haven't read historical and moral essays of Lord Acton, I could recommend picking this book up. I think it's a pretty potentially valuable read. I think there is some commentary in here and some statements made which merit consideration, I'll say. So yes. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.